To the internet, Arthur Chatto was just a viral sensation, the shirtless royal who broke the internet with a gym selfie. But look closer, and that image wasn't vanity, it was armor. Arthur is the grandson of Princess Margaret, the Windsor's most tragic spare, and he inherited a legacy defined by addiction, heartbreak, and volatile genius. This is not a story about a privileged boy playing soldier. It is the story of a young man desperately trying to outrun a genetic curse. He began trading the velvet of Kensington Palace for the brutal mud of Royal Marines training, a shift that many observers saw as an attempt to confront, through sheer physical discipline, the volatile Snowdon legacy in his family. But as Arthur would discover in the most devastating way possible, you can train your muscles to be iron, but you cannot train your bones to forget where they came from. We have to look backward. We have to peel back the layers of velvet to expose the tragedy that sits at the very foundation of his existence. Arthur is the endpoint of a genetic line defined by two warring impulses: the suffocating duty of the Windsors and the destructive artistic brilliance of the Snowdons. He is the grandson of the most tragic love story in royal history and the survivor of a family trauma that destroyed almost everyone it touched. The story begins long before Arthur was born, in the smoke-filled, whiskey-soaked drawing rooms of Kensington Palace in the 1960s. This was the era of his grandmother, Princess Margaret. If Queen Elizabeth was the crown, steady, stoic, immovable, then Margaret was the shadow. She was the original spare, the spare heir born with too much charisma and nowhere to put it. Margaret was beautiful, witty, and deeply, profoundly damaged. She had been denied the right to marry her first love, Peter Townsend, by the very institution she represented. That heartbreak calcified her. It turned her into a woman who consumed life voraciously because she felt life had cheated her. And then she met Anthony Armstrong Jones. Arthur's grandfather, who had become Lord Snowdon, was a creature from a different universe. He was a photographer, a bohemian, a man who moved through the underground worlds of London's art scene with a camera in one hand and a cigarette in the other. He was small, crippled by childhood polio, but possessed of a ferocious, almost cruel sexual magnetism. When Margaret and Tony married, it was described as the union of a panther and a peacock. It was glamorous, it was modern, and it was doomed. Arthur Chatto carries the genes of this collision. His bloodline is a mixture of ancient royalty and modern artistic rage. The marriage of his grandparents wasn't just a relationship, it was a war zone. Kensington Palace, where Arthur would later visit as a child, was the battlefield. It was a home filled with screaming matches, slamming doors, and psychological warfare. Tony Snowdon was known to leave hateful notes in Margaret's books for her to find, cruel little jabs about her appearance or her intelligence. Margaret, in turn, drank heavily to numb the pain of being married to a man who refused to bow to her. This is the background radiation of Arthur's life. Most royal children inherit castles and titles. Arthur inherited a legacy of brilliant dysfunction. The Snowdon volatility is a whispered phrase in royal circles, a fear that the children or grandchildren would inherit Tony's cruelty or Margaret's self-destruction. But nature, in its mercy, sometimes skips a beat. Or perhaps it offers a chance for correction. Arthur's mother, Lady Sarah Chatto, grew up in the eye of this hurricane. As a child, she listened to her parents tearing each other apart. She watched her mother, the princess, slowly disintegrate under the weight of public scrutiny and private misery. Sarah learned a survival lesson that she would one day pass on to her son. Invisibility is a superpower. While her brother David went into the family business of furniture making in high society, Sarah chose to disappear. She married Daniel Chatto, a quiet, unassuming actor who became an artist. They didn't marry in Westminster Abbey with the world watching. They had a small private wedding. They didn't live in a palace. They moved to a terraced house. Sarah, arguably the Queen's favorite niece, became a professional introvert. She painted landscapes. She wore cardigans instead of tiaras. She effectively built a firewall between her family and the royal madness. When Arthur was born in 1999, he was born behind this firewall. His early childhood was a masterpiece of curation. To the outside world, the Chatto boys, Arthur and his older brother Sam, were the perfect royal children. They were the boys who never threw tantrums at the Jubilee. They were the boys who looked like cherubs in their chorister robes at Westminster Abbey. There is a specific image from this era that defines Arthur's early role. It is 2012. He is 13 years old, serving as a page of honor to the Queen. He's dressed in the archaic, heavy uniform of the court, a scarlet tunic with gold braiding, white breeches, buckled shoes, and a lace jabot. He is holding the heavy velvet train of the monarch's robe. He is literally carrying the weight of the crown, walking 3 paces behind his great aunt. At that moment, Arthur was the ultimate insider. He was deep in the belly of the beast. He saw the monarchy not as a fairy tale, but as a machine. He saw the aging queen, his granny, taking off her shoes and rubbing her tired feet after a ceremony. He saw the tension in Prince Charles's jaw. He saw the way the courtiers scuttled around, managing the image, managing the silence. But beneath the scarlet tunic, something was happening. Arthur was not his brother Sam. Sam Chatto took after their mother, Sarah, gentle, artistic, a lover of pottery and yoga, a soul who sought peace in the clay. Arthur was different. Arthur had the Snowdon spark. He had a physical restlessness, a kinetic energy that couldn't be satisfied by painting watercolors or arranging flowers. He was sent to Eton College, the legendary boarding school that serves as the incubator for the British ruling class. Eton is a strange, archaic place, a school where teenagers wear tailcoats to math class and the hierarchy is brutal. For a boy like Arthur, Eton was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he was royalty. He was the Queen's grandnephew. He was protected. On the other hand, he was minor royalty. At Eton, he was in the same ecosystem as the families who run the world. He was surrounded by the sons of oligarchs and dukes, and he was acutely aware of the War of the Waleses that had played out a generation before. His cousins William and Harry were the suns around which the royal galaxy revolved. Arthur was just a distant moon. It is a difficult psychological position for a young man, to be close enough to the throne to feel the heat, but too far away to hold the power. You are expected to behave like a prince, but you have to make your own way like a commoner. You have the restrictions, but none of the glory. It was in the ancient, damp gymnasiums of Eton, and during the holidays in the Scottish Highlands, that Arthur began to construct his escape pod. If he couldn't control his lineage, and if he couldn't control the protocols that dictated his life, he would control the one thing that truly belonged to him, his body. This wasn't just about fitness, it was about armor. While his peers were sneaking cigarettes behind the cricket pavilion, echoing the vices of Princess Margaret, Arthur was lifting iron. He began to transform. The cherubic face of the page of honor squared off. The jawline sharpened, the shoulders broadened. He was building a shell that was impenetrable. It was a subconscious rejection of the physical frailty that had plagued his grandfather Snowdon and his grandmother Margaret. Arthur was declaring cell by cell, muscle fiber by muscle fiber, that he would be strong. By the time he reached his late teens, the contrast was jarring. In the official family photos, he looked like a young Edwardian gentleman. But underneath the tweed jackets was the body of a mixed martial artist. He was living a dual existence, the polite, artistic Chatto son by day, and the intense physical Snowden heir by night. And then came the internet. The digital age has been a catastrophe for the mystery of the monarchy. But for Arthur, it was a temptation. He belonged to the first generation of royals who grew up with an iPhone in their pocket as a prosthetic limb. Instagram offered something the palace never could: direct feedback, validation that wasn't based on his rank but on his image. When he posted that first shirtless photo, he likely didn't anticipate the firestorm. He was just a teenage boy proud of his gains. But the reaction was a wake-up call. The tabloids went feral. The hunk of the House of Windsor, the royal six-pack. Suddenly, Arthur Chatto wasn't just Sarah's quiet son anymore. He was a commodity. For a moment, he leaned into it. There were more photos. Trekking in the mountains, diving in the Arctic, rowing on the Thames. He was curating an image of the action prince. It was intoxicating. For a boy raised in a culture of extreme repression, where every emotion is swallowed and every public appearance is scripted, the ability to present himself as a dominant physical male was a drug. But Arthur was intelligent. He was his grandfather's grandson, after all. Tony Snowden was a man who understood the power of the lens, but he also understood the hollowness of fame. To many, the situation looked like a trap, slowly closing around him. He saw what was happening to his cousin Harry. By 2017 and 2018, the saga of Harry and Meghan was dominating the world. Arthur watched as Harry, the soldier prince, was consumed by the celebrity machine, trapped in a cycle of victimhood and media warfare. He saw how the press devoured the spare. It became increasingly clear that if he continued down this path, he risked becoming Kensington Palace's resident himbo, famous for his looks and his proximity to the crown, but devoid of any real substance. He would be a decorative object, just like the vases in his mother's drawing room, and that terrified him. The Snowden demon inside him wanted more. It wanted intensity. It wanted reality. It wanted to feel something other than the soft, suffocating velvet of royal life. He didn't want to be watched. He wanted to be tested. As he stood on the precipice of adulthood, graduating from Eton and looking at the University of Edinburgh, Arthur Chatto made a silent vow. From the outside, it looked as though he was deliberately dismantling the prince and the Instagram star persona, choosing a far harsher and more demanding path instead. He didn't know it yet, but he was looking towards the gray, churning waters of the British coastline. He was looking towards a challenge that would strip the skin from his hands and the ego from his soul. The boy who carried the Queen's train was about to drop the velvet and pick up the oars. The rebellion had begun, but unlike his grandmother's rebellion, this one wouldn't be fought with whiskey and diamonds. It would be fought with salt and sweat. Edinburgh is a city of ghosts, with its Gothic spires, cobblestone streets, and the brooding presence of the castle atop the volcanic rock. It is a place where history feels heavy in the air. For Arthur Chatto, arriving at the University of Edinburgh in 2018 to study history of art, the city offered a convenient stage for his double life. On the surface, he was just another undergraduate, a handsome, well-spoken boy in a barber jacket, attending lectures, drinking pints in the dark pubs of the Cowgate, and blending into the student population. But in the digital ether, he was becoming a myth. The Instagram prince phenomenon was spiraling. Every time he posted a photo, whether it was a shot of him lifting weights or a candid picture from a hike, the engagement numbers spiked. The comments section was a deluge of adoration, objectification, and curiosity. The media had latched onto him as the antidote to the stuffy, buttoned-up image of the monarchy. He was the cool royal. He was the hot royal. He was the royal you could imagine having a beer with, or more illicitly, taking home. But inside the mind of the 20-year-old Arthur, a dissonance was growing. It was the same cognitive dissonance that had driven his grandmother, Princess Margaret, to the bottle. It was the feeling of being observed but not seen. The likes on Instagram were empty calories. They were a digital applause for a performance he wasn't sure he wanted to give. He knew, with the instinctive sharpness of the Snowden bloodline, that this kind of fame was a trap. It was brittle. It relied on youth, beauty, and novelty. And if there was one thing the history of his family had taught him, it was that beauty fades and novelty turns into scandal. He needed something real. He needed an antidote to the softness of his existence. He had grown up sleeping on high thread count sheets, eating meals prepared by chefs, and having doors open for him by men in uniforms. The privilege was comfortable, but it was also suffocating. It denied him the one thing that defines a man's character: struggle. He looked at his hands, hands that had held the Queen's velvet train, hands that had held champagne flutes, and he wondered if they were capable of anything primal. In 2020, amidst the global paralysis of the pandemic, Arthur found his answer. It didn't come in the form of a royal duty or a society wedding. It came in the form of a fiberglass boat. The challenge was called the GB Row. It is widely considered one of the toughest endurance challenges on the planet. The premise is deceptively simple. Row a boat unsupported around the entire coastline of Great Britain. 2,000 miles, the North Sea, the Irish Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. It is a route that has swallowed Spanish galleons and German U-boats. It is cold, it is volatile, and it is unforgiving. When Arthur announced he was joining a four-man team to undertake this expedition, the reaction from the royal establishment was likely one of bemused concern. This wasn't a fun run for charity. This was dangerous. If the weather turned, people died doing this. But for Arthur, the danger was the point. The ocean is the ultimate meritocracy. The waves crashing against the hull of a rowing boat do not care if your great aunt is the Queen of England. The salt water that scours your skin does not respect your title. Out there, there is no protocol. There is only physics and biology. The preparation was brutal, but the reality of the row, which began in the summer of 2020, was a descent into a kind of hell that Arthur had never imagined. The team, Arthur and three friends, Charles Cousins, Harry Wentworth Stanley, and Oliver Daw Lane, pushed off from Tower Bridge in London. The photos from that day show Arthur smiling, looking fit and optimistic in his technical gear. He looked like the action prince the magazines adored. But as the London skyline faded and they hit the open water of the estuary, the glamour evaporated. Life on the boat, named Exy Endurance, was a lesson in claustrophobia and deprivation. The boat was just 10 meters long. There was no toilet, just a bucket. There was no kitchen, just a gas stove to boil water for dehydrated rations. But the true torture was the schedule. They rowed in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 24 hours a day, for weeks. 2 hours on, 2 hours off sounds manageable until you actually do it. It means you never get more than 90 minutes of sleep at a time. It means you are waking up wet, cold, and disoriented, forcing your stiff body back onto the sliding seat to pull the oars through the heavy water in the pitch black of night. It is a rhythm designed to break the human psyche. As they rounded the coast and headed north, Arthur began to shed the layers of his royal identity. The first thing to go was the vanity. On Instagram, he was the Prince of Pecs. On the boat, he was a biological machine that was slowly breaking down. He developed salt sores, raw, weeping wounds caused by the friction of wet clothes against skin mixed with crystallized salt. They appeared on his hands, his back, and most painfully, on his backside. Every stroke of the oar was an act of agony. Then came the hallucinations. Sleep deprivation is a powerful hallucinogen. In the dead of night, staring out at the endless black horizon of the North Sea, the mind begins to invent things to fill the void. Arthur later admitted to seeing things in the waves, but unlike the demons that haunted his grandmother in the bottom of a whiskey glass, these demons could be rode through. He learned that if you just keep pulling, the darkness eventually gives way to dawn. There was a specific phase of the journey as they navigated the treacherous waters off the coast of Scotland, the land of his ancestors, where the Snowdon demon finally found a constructive outlet. This was the territory where his family spent their summers at Balmoral, engaging in the cosplay of rustic life, picnics in the heather, stalking deer with ghillies. But Arthur was seeing the true face of the landscape. He was seeing it from the waterline, fighting the currents that battered the cliffs. It was here, amidst the freezing spray and the gray swells, that Arthur Chatto ceased to be a royal. The hierarchy on the boat was flat. When a wave crashed over the deck at 3 a.m., soaking them to the bone, nobody cared about precedence or protocol. They only cared about who could hold the course. Arthur found a profound liberation in this. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being judged on his lineage. He was being judged on his output. He was pulling his weight, literally. The dynamic on the boat was intense. 4 men, trapped in a fiberglass capsule, smelling of sweat and unwashed bodies, fueled by freeze-dried spaghetti bolognese and adrenaline. In this pressure cooker, the polite veneer of the aristocracy melted away. There was no room for the stiff upper lip. If you were hurting, you said it. If you were breaking, you leaned on your brothers. The expedition revealed a striking capacity for endurance that went far beyond what his earlier public image might have suggested. He found that when his body screamed, "Stop," there was a quiet, cold voice in his head that said more. This was the Armstrong-Jones legacy, the obsessive drive of his grandfather, repurposed. Lord Snowdon had used that drive to capture the perfect photograph, hanging out of helicopters or staying up for days in the darkroom. Arthur was using it to conquer the Atlantic. But the journey wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. There is a monastic quality to ocean rowing. The repetition of the stroke, catch, drive, finish, recovery becomes a mantra. Hours of silence, punctuated only by the sound of the oars and the wind, gave Arthur time to think that he had never possessed in the cluttered noise of London. He thought about his future. He thought about the trap of his birth. For a young man in his position, the predictable path, a job in the art world, a suitable marriage, a quiet life as Lady Sarah's son, could easily feel like a cage. It was a comfortable cage lined with silk, but it was still a cage. He looked at his hands, blistered and calloused, bleeding into the oar handles, and realized he liked these hands better than the manicured ones that held the champagne. These were the hands of a man who was earning his existence. The turning point came during a particularly brutal storm in the Irish Sea. The waves were towering, tossing the small boat like a toy. The wind was screaming. It was a moment of genuine peril. In that chaos, the Instagram prince was dead. There was no audience. There was no camera filter. There was just the cold reality of survival. And in that moment, Arthur didn't feel fear. He felt a strange electric clarity. He felt alive. He realized that he didn't just want to survive this. He wanted to master it. He craved the competence that comes from operating in high-stakes environments. When the team finally rowed back under Tower Bridge, 42 days after they left, they were changed men. They had broken the world record for the youngest team to circumnavigate Great Britain. They had raised a fortune for charity. The media was waiting. The cameras flashed. The journalists shouted questions. Arthur, Arthur, how does it feel? Arthur, show us the muscles. To the press, it was a triumphant photo op. The hunk had returned looking rugged and bearded, a real-life Aquaman. They wrote articles about his transformation, focusing on the physical aesthetics. The beard, the tan, the lean muscle mass. They treated it as a gap-year adventure, a fun story to fill the pages between royal scandals. But looking at the footage from that day, there is a different look in Arthur's eyes. It is the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has seen the edge. He smiled for the cameras. He hugged his mother. He played the part. But internally, he had already moved on. The GB row hadn't satisfied his hunger. It had only whetted it. He realized that the adventure wasn't enough. An adventure ends. You go back to normal life. You put the suit back on. You go back to the parties. Arthur didn't want to go back. He realized he couldn't go back. The civilization of Kensington and Chelsea felt thin and trivial compared to the absolute truth of the ocean. He needed a way to make that feeling permanent. He needed a profession that demanded that level of intensity every single day. He didn't want to be an adventurer who did stunts for sponsorship. He wanted to be a professional. He wanted to belong to a tribe that understood the language of suffering and silence. It was during the decompression from the row, while his body was healing and his mind was readjusting to the noise of land, that the idea of the Royal Marines began to take concrete shape. The Royal Marines are not the Army. They are not the gentlemen's regiments like the Blues and Royals or the Grenadier Guards, where officers often come from the same social circles as the princes. The Royal Marines are the commandos. They are the amphibious infantry, the tip of the spear. Their ethos is cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Their training is the longest and hardest in the Western world. Joining the Marines wasn't a career move, it was an identity transplant. Arthur knew the risks. He knew that if he applied, he would be marked. He would be the royal recruit. The instructors would target him. The press would hunt for stories of him failing. He remembered the stories of his uncle, Prince Edward, who had famously dropped out of the Royal Marines training in the 1980s. The media had crucified Edward, labeling him weak, a quitter. The shadow of that failure hung over the family's relationship with the Corps. If Arthur went in, he had to finish. There was no try. Failure would be a public humiliation that would confirm every stereotype about the pampered prince. It would undo everything he had proven on the boat. But the fear of failure was overshadowed by the fear of mediocrity. Arthur looked at the path of his cousin Harry, who had left the military and was now navigating the treacherous waters of Hollywood, selling his story to keep the lights on. Arthur saw the indignity of that trade. He saw that Harry, for all his talk of freedom, was still shackled to his identity as a prince. He was monetizing his blood. Arthur chose the opposite. He chose to shed blood. He quietly began the application process. He didn't issue a press release. He didn't tell his Instagram followers. He ghosted his own digital life. The thirst trap photos stopped. The updates ceased. He went dark. He began training specifically for the PRMC, the gateway to officer training. He ran with weighted packs in the dead of night. He practiced the beep test until his lungs burned. He wasn't training for a beach body anymore. He was training for functional lethality. This was the quiet before the storm. The world thought Arthur Chatto was just enjoying his post-university life, perhaps looking for a job in the art world like his father. They had no idea that the grandson of Princess Margaret was preparing to walk into the recruiting office at Limpstone and sign his life away to the crown. not as a prince, but as a number. The boy who had run away to sea was about to become the man who marched into the mud. The Snowdon demon had been tamed by the ocean, and now it was about to be weaponized. If the Atlantic Ocean was the baptism of Arthur Chatto, the Commando Training Center Royal Marines at Lympstone was his crucible. Located on the edge of the estuary in Devon, Lympstone is not merely a military base. It is a mythic landscape in the British military psyche. It is a place where young men are pushed through a grinder of physical and psychological trials to see if they can be reassembled into something harder, calmer, and more dependable. For decades, it has been the graveyard of egos. In 2021, Arthur Chatto walked through those gates not as a royal, but as a recruit in the young officer batch. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. While his cousins, William and Harry, had attended Sandhurst, the prestigious officer academy for the Army, known for its polished corridors and gentlemanly tradition, Lympstone is different. The Royal Marines are the shock troops. They are an amphibious light infantry force that prides itself on being the hardest, the fastest, and the most austere. There is a saying in the Corps, the Green Beret is not given, it is earned. It is the only beret in the British military that cannot be bought with a title or a family connection. You have to pass the tests, and the tests are designed to find your breaking point and push you past it. When Arthur arrived, he brought with him the inevitable baggage of his last name, but he also brought a darker shadow, the ghost of his uncle, Prince Edward. In 1987, Prince Edward had attempted this same course. He had famously cracked. The media had feasted on the story of the Queen's youngest son dropping out, cementing a narrative that the royals were too soft for the Corps. The Edward effect was the elephant in the room. Every instructor, every fellow recruit, and certainly every tabloid editor was waiting for Arthur Chatto to ring the bell. They were waiting for the Instagram prince to realize that mud doesn't look good on a filter. But Arthur had a secret weapon. He had already stripped his ego in the North Sea. The training for a Royal Marines officer is rigorous. 15 months of hell. It is widely regarded as the toughest infantry training course in the NATO alliance. It begins with the systematic dismantling of the civilian self. For Arthur, this meant the complete erasure of his status. In the barracks, there are no titles. There is no privacy. You sleep in a room with other men, smelling their sweat, hearing their snores, sharing the collective anxiety of the next morning's inspection. For a young man who grew up with a staff to manage his life, the shock of having to polish his own boots until they gleamed like mirrors, to iron his creases to a razor's edge, and to organize his locker with millimeter precision, was a culture shock more profound than any foreign travel. The instructors, the color sergeants with their stone faces and voices that can strip paint off a wall, would have been merciless. In the meritocracy of the Corps, a famous name is just a bigger target. The banter, the uniquely British strain of military sarcasm, would almost certainly have targeted his background, with jokes about palace pillows and royal relatives never far from the surface. By all accounts, he kept his head down, speaking little and focusing on his performance, a common survival strategy in that environment. He adopted the gray man strategy: be average in the barracks, be exceptional in the field, and never ever draw attention to yourself. The physical training at Lympstone is legendary. It takes place on the bottom field and the unforgiving terrain of Woodbury Common. It involves yomping, marching with heavy packs weighing up to 70 pounds, plus a rifle, across boggy, undulating ground for miles on end. It is a test of pure, grinding endurance. This is where the gym muscles of the Instagram prince had to be converted into functional steel. Bench pressing 100 kilograms doesn't help you when you are chest deep in freezing mud, shivering uncontrollably, trying to read a map while an instructor screams at you to move faster. This is soldier fit. It is about durability, not aesthetics. Arthur's body began to change again. The glamour muscles faded, replaced by the ropey, hardened sinew of a long-distance predator. But the physical pain was secondary to the psychological pressure. The essence of commando training is to exhaust the recruit to the point of collapse and then ask them to make complex tactical decisions. It simulates the chaos of war. For Arthur, this was the ultimate test of the Snowden intellect. His grandfather, Lord Snowden, was a brilliant, sharp-minded man who thrived on complexity. Arthur found that under pressure, his mind didn't panic, it sharpened. He discovered a strange solace in the suffering. On the bleak moors of Dartmoor, with the rain lashing sideways and the fog rolling in, the world of royalty felt 1,000,000 miles away. There were no paparazzi here. There were no expectations to marry a duchess. There was only the man in front of you and the man behind you. This brotherhood was the drug Arthur had been seeking his whole life. In the Royal Marines, your background is irrelevant. You are judged solely on your reliability. Can I trust you to cover my arc of fire? Can I trust you to carry the extra ammo? Can I trust you not to quit? Arthur bonded with men from council estates in Liverpool and farms in Yorkshire. He became just Chatto. And in that anonymity, he found his true identity. As the weeks turned into months, the attrition rate soared. Recruits dropped out with stress fractures, hypothermia, or simply because their minds broke. The Edward curse loomed large, but Arthur didn't quit. He thrived. He embodied the commando ethos, cheerfulness in the face of adversity. Accounts from those around him suggest he adapted well to the hardship, often maintaining a dry, understated sense of humor, even when conditions were at their worst. He was proving that the resilience of the Queen, the woman who had sat stoically through wars and crises, ran in his veins just as strongly as the artistic turbulence of the snow dawns. The climax of the training did not arrive as a single event, but as a relentless 4-day crescendo of physical destruction known as the commando tests, where the margin between earning the Green Beret and going home empty-handed is measured in mere seconds. Arthur was immediately thrown into the endurance course, a 6-mile crucifixion through submerged tunnels and freezing mud, demanding that he steady his shaking hands long enough to hit a target, with eyes stinging from the grit. There was no time to recover. The pain of the tunnels was immediately compounded by the 9-mile speed march, a lung-bursting sprint against the clock carrying full fighting order, followed by the vertigo-inducing agility of the Tarzan assault course. But these were merely the warm-up acts for the true reckoning, the 30-miler. This is the holy grail of the Royal Marines. It is no longer a test of fitness. It is an examination of the soul. For 8 hours across the unforgiving granite of Dartmoor, as his hips ground bone on bone and his energy reserves evaporated, Arthur stopped running on muscle. He began running on pure pride, powered by a ferocious will to prove that the velvet of his upbringing had not softened the iron of his resolve. Like so many training days on Dartmoor, the conditions during his 30-miler were reported to be as unforgiving as the route itself. But as he crossed the finish line, stumbling but upright, he didn't just finish a run, he crossed a metaphysical line. The ceremony that followed was understated. The presentation of the Green Beret. It is a piece of green felt, but to the men who wear it, it is a religious object. When Arthur Chatto had that beret placed on his head, he had done something no other member of the extended royal family had managed in generations. He had entered the warrior class on its own terms. The news, when it leaked, was met with shock. The Instagram prince was now a troop commander. The queen was reportedly delighted and proud. It was a massive PR win for the family, a counter-narrative to the chaos of the Harry and Meghan exit. Here was a young royal who served in silence, who sought excellence rather than exposure. But for Arthur, it wasn't a PR stunt. It was a vacation. He was assigned to 42 Commando, a unit based in Plymouth, specializing in maritime operations. He was ready to deploy. He was ready to lead men into combat. He had successfully transformed himself from a decorative object into a highly trained instrument of the state. He had beaten the soft prince allegations. He had exorcised the ghost of Prince Edward. He had proven that the Snowdon blood could be disciplined. However, the tragedy of the Greek myths, and the Windsor tragedies often feel like Greek myths, is that just when the hero proves his worth, the fates intervene. Arthur had conquered his mind. He had conquered the training. But there was one enemy he hadn't accounted for: the limits of his own anatomy. The Snowdon legacy is one of fragility as much as fire. His grandfather was crippled by polio. His grandmother was plagued by strokes and illness. The body, no matter how much you armor it with muscle, carries the blueprints of its ancestors. Just as Arthur was preparing for the life he had fought so hard to earn, just as he was stepping into the role of the warrior prince, he began to feel a pain. Not the good pain of a workout, but the bad pain of structural failure. It started as a whisper in his back, a warning signal from the nervous system. He ignored it, as Marines do. You push through, you adapt, you overcome. But biology does not negotiate with willpower. The rigorous pounding of the yomps, the crushing weight of the Bergen, the sheer physical violence of the training had exposed a genetic weakness. The steel will was there, but the chassis was cracking. Arthur Chatto stood at the peak of his young life, wearing the green beret, looking out at a future of service and silence. For a moment it looked as if he had outrun his royal blood and won, or so he thought. He didn't know that the victory lap was about to turn into a medical evacuation. The hardest battle wasn't the 30-miler. It was the conversation he was about to have with a doctor that would shatter his world all over again. The story of Arthur Chatto's time in the Royal Marines is a rebuke to the modern obsession with identity. In a world where we are told to find ourselves by looking inward, Arthur found himself by looking outward, by submitting to a code stricter and older than himself. He proved that nobility isn't about the title you inherit, but the burden you choose to carry. His success at Lympston was the ultimate vindication of the spare. While the heir gets the crown, the spare, if he is brave enough, gets the sword. But swords, as Arthur was about to discover, are double-edged. The tragedy of his story is not that he failed, but that he succeeded too well, pushing a mortal body to keep up with an immortal spirit. The irony of the human body is that it has no sense of dramatic timing. It does not care that you have just achieved the impossible. It does not care that you have silenced the critics, earned the green beret, or rewritten the destiny of your family. It simply calculates the load, the stress, and the structural integrity of the bone, and when the math no longer works, it shatters. For Arthur Chatto, the crash came in the silence that followed the applause. The King's Squad pass-out parade is a moment of supreme, intoxicating glory. The drums beating, the boots stamping in perfect unison, the pride of the family watching from the stands. But when the parade is over, the adrenaline fades. And in the cold light of a Monday morning in the barracks, Arthur woke up to a betrayal that felt ancient. The pain was not the sharp, clean burn of muscle fatigue that he had grown to love in the gym. It was a dull, grinding wrongness deep in the architecture of his body. It was the Snowden legacy coming to collect its debt. Throughout history, the Armstrong-Jones bloodline has been defined by a cruel juxtaposition, a fierce, indomitable will trapped inside a fragile vessel. His grandfather, Tony Snowden, had swung through the trees of his estate on ropes, drove fast cars, and chased women, all while dragging a leg withered by polio. He lived his life in defiance of his own anatomy. Arthur had tried to do the same. He had built a suit of armor out of muscle, layer by layer, believing that if he was strong enough, he could insulate himself from the frailty that haunted his grandmother Margaret's final years. But the Royal Marines training is designed to find the microscopic cracks in a man's foundation and hammer a wedge into them. The months of yomping with 70 pounds on his back, the sleeping in freezing ditches, the relentless impact of boots on tarmac, it had taken a toll that no amount of deadlifts could prevent. The medical assessment was a quiet, sterile affair, a stark contrast to the shouting and mud of the commando tests. In a small room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, a doctor looked at X-rays and MRI scans. Medical assessments reportedly showed signs of significant strain on his back and lower body, unusually heavy wear for someone so young. For a young officer who had just been handed the keys to his dream, the news was a psychological amputation. He was moved off the main training track and into rehabilitation, the limbo where injured recruits either recover enough to continue or face being discharged. This is the chapter of the story that the Instagram followers never saw. There were no heroic photos of Arthur sitting in a rehab center, doing microscopic exercises with a resistance band, watching the rain streak against the window while his troop deployed without him. The isolation was crushing. In the military, your identity is your utility. If you can fight, you are a brother. If you are broken, you are a ghost. Arthur was suddenly stripped of the purpose that had fueled his escape from the palace. He was no longer the action prince. He was just a patient. And in that vacuum of activity, the demons he had outrun on the rowing boat and outworked on the assault course began to circle back. This is the specific tragedy of the spare in the modern age. Prince Harry had filled the void with partying, then the army, then a wife, then a media war. Arthur had filled it with physical suffering, but now that the suffering was pathological rather than purposeful, he was forced to confront the question he had been avoiding since he was a teenager at Eton. Who is Arthur Chatto if he isn't carrying a weapon? The press, always sharks sensing blood in the water, began to sniff around. The whispers started. Has the Royal Marine dream ended? Is he too soft after all? The narrative was poised to flip. They wanted to write the story of the quitter, the boy who played at being a soldier until it got too hard. Arthur felt the weight of the Edward effect returning. His uncle Edward had left the Marines because he didn't like it. Arthur loved it, but his body was rejecting it. The distinction would be lost in the headlines. He was terrified of becoming a punchline, another Windsor who couldn't hack the real world. During those long, gray months of rehabilitation, Arthur often retreated to the only place that made sense, the coast. He would sit by the ocean, the same ocean he had conquered during the GB row, and look at the horizon. But the water didn't offer clarity anymore. It offered a reflection. He began to see the uncomfortable parallels between himself and his grandmother, Princess Margaret. Margaret had spent her life trying to find a role. She tried to be the dutiful sister, the glamorous socialite, the patron of the arts. But she was always thwarted by the church, by the government, by her health. She ended her life in a wheelchair, wearing dark glasses to hide the ravages of strokes, a prisoner of her own failing body. The comparison with his grandmother's decline made the prospect of long-term injury especially unsettling. Was this it? Was he destined to be a broken aristocrat, dining out on stories of what could have been, soothing his ego with gin and bitterness? But the Snowden blood is not just about frailty, it is about reinvention. Lord Snowden didn't let polio stop him, he just found different ways to move. He designed invalid carriages, he built gadgets, he adapted. Arthur realized that toughness wasn't just about how much weight you can carry, it's about how you handle the load when you can't carry it anymore. He stopped trying to force his body back into the mold of a 19-year-old recruit. He began to approach his recovery with the same forensic intelligence he had applied to his art history degree. He studied anatomy, he studied nutrition. He turned his rehabilitation into a new mission. It was a humbling process. The Superman complex had to die. He had to accept that he was mortal. He had to accept that he was a prince of the realm, yes, but he was also a biological organism with limits. During this period, he reportedly had quiet conversations with his mother, Lady Sarah. Sarah Chatto is the unsung heroine of this story. She is the keeper of the family secrets, the woman who saw the destruction of her parents and chose peace. She likely told Arthur the truth that no drill sergeant could teach him. You don't have to prove anything to them. You don't have to die to be valid. There was a shifting of tectonic plates in Arthur's soul. Taken together, the extreme fitness, the rowing, the mud, his choices can be read as a form of running away from the traditional royal script. He was running away from the velvet cage, from the constant comparison to William and Harry, and from the quiet terror of becoming just another drifting socialite. But in the quiet of the rehab gym, he realized that he couldn't run anymore. He had to stand still, and in standing still, he found a new kind of strength. It wasn't the aggressive, outward-facing strength of the commando. It was a quiet, internal solidity. He eventually returned to duty, but the shiny idealism was gone. He was no longer the boy seeking adventure. He was a young man who understood the cost of ambition. He served not for the glory or for the Instagram photo or to prove a point to the tabloids. He served because it was his job. The tragedy of this phase wasn't the injury itself. The tragedy was the death of the dream of total escape. Arthur realized that he could never truly be just Chatto. The body would always fail, the press would always watch, and the name would always follow him. The Green Beret was a hat, not a magic helmet of invisibility. As 2022 bled into 2023, the world around him changed again. The Queen, the constant North Star of his life, the woman whose heavy train he had carried, died. The monarchy shifted. Charles became king. The minor royals were pushed further to the periphery. Harry released Spare, a book that detonated the remaining bridges between the exiles and the institution. Arthur watched this from the distance of the barracks. He read the headlines about his cousin Harry's genetic pain and his war against the family. And Arthur, nursing his own physical pain, nursing the genetic legacy of the Snowdens, made a different choice. He didn't write a book. He didn't do an interview. He didn't complain about the unfairness of his back or the cruelty of the press. He simply tightened his bootlaces and went to work. But the question remained, hanging over him like the sword of Damocles. How long can this last? His medical history was now a factor, and concerns about underlying structural weaknesses could not simply be ignored. Arthur Chatto was walking a tightrope. He was the last Snowden prince, balancing between the duty of the soldier and the decay of the aristocrat. He had tried to turn himself into a machine to escape his humanity, only to find that his humanity was the one thing he couldn't drill out of himself. The cracked chassis of his body was a reminder, you are not iron, you are flesh, and flesh eventually returns to the dust. As he looked towards the future, Arthur faced a new terrifying horizon. It wasn't the ocean, and it wasn't the battlefield. It was the prospect of a life after the physical peak. If the Marines couldn't hold him forever, where would he go? The palace gates were open, waiting to swallow him back into the world of garden parties and meaningless titles. For a man who had tasted the raw, salt-laced reality of the sea, the prospect of returning to the goldfish bowl was a fate worse than death. He had to find a third way. He had to forge a path that was neither royal nor marine, but something entirely new. But to do that, he would have to break the ultimate rule of his family. He would have to stop performing and start living. Pain is a masterful editor. It cuts out the superfluous. It deletes the ego. It leaves only what is essential. In the rehab ward, Arthur Chatto lost the illusion of invincibility that defines youth. He learned that the Snowden curse wasn't just about addiction or scandal. It was about the unbearable friction between a soaring spirit and a limiting reality. He had tried to be a Spartan, but he was forced to admit he was a Snowden. The tragedy was not in the injury, but in the realization that there is no escape pod from your own heritage. You carry your ancestors in your marrow. The question was no longer, how do I run from this, but how do I carry this without breaking? If you stand on the cliffs of the Scottish coast, looking out at the North Sea where Arthur Chatto once rode for his life, you realize that the loudest sound isn't the crashing waves, but the silence between them. In the cacophony of the modern House of Windsor, a dynasty that has become a global soap opera of podcasts, memoirs, and televised grievances, Arthur Chatto has chosen to inhabit that silence. It is a choice that makes him an anomaly, a ghost in the machine, and perhaps the only true victor in a game where everyone else seems to be losing. By 2023, the landscape of the British monarchy had changed irrevocably. The death of Queen Elizabeth II marked the end of the long 20th century for the royals. The buffer was gone. King Charles III ascended to a throne that was smaller, leaner, and under siege from the digital age. But the most violent assault on the institution didn't come from Republicans or politicians. It came from within. Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, was released like a cluster bomb. It dominated the cultural conversation for months. Harry spoke of his genetic pain, his frozen todger, his fistfights with William, and his hatred of the press. He monetized his trauma. He turned the gilded cage into a content farm. And there, in the background, unnoticed by the op-ed columnists and the Twitter warriors, stood Arthur Chatto. The contrast between the two cousins, Harry, the Prince of Noise, and Arthur, the Prince of Silence, is the defining dialectic of the modern royal family. They are mirror images, distorted by different choices. Both were spares. Both were athletic, action-oriented young men who chafed against the stuffiness of court life. Both sought escape in the military. Both had mothers who were deeply scarred by the royal fishbowl. But while Harry decided that the only way to survive was to burn the house down and sell the ashes, Arthur decided to reinforce the foundations. Arthur's return to duty after his injury was not a triumphant cinematic montage. It was a quiet, grinding reality. He didn't issue a press release about his resilience. He simply reintegrated into the core. He accepted that his body was fallible, and he adjusted his expectations. He learned the lesson that separates the boy from the man. You are not the main character of the universe. In the Royal Marines, the mission comes first, the team comes second, and you come last. This gray man philosophy, the Marine ethos of blending in, of being exceptionally competent but virtually invisible, became Arthur's armor against the celebrity culture that tried to consume him. He could have been a star. The offers were undoubtedly there. Fashion brands would have paid millions for the hot Royal Marine to front a cologne campaign. Reality TV producers would have killed to have him on SAS. Who dares wins. He could have launched a fitness app, a YouTube channel, a lifestyle brand. He could have been the king of influencers, leveraging his blue blood and his green beret for unimaginable wealth. He rejected all of it. In doing so, Arthur Chatto performed a radical act of counterculture. In an era where visibility is equated with value, where if you don't post it, it didn't happen, Arthur chose to disappear. He quietly deleted the shirtless photos and the self-conscious glamour shots. He scrubbed his digital footprint. He retreated into the aggressive normalcy that his mother, Lady Sarah, had spent her life cultivating. This retreat is not a defeat, it is a strategic victory. By refusing to play the media's game, Arthur starved the beast. The tabloids can't write about you if you give them nothing. They can't mock your failures if they don't know what you're doing. They can't deconstruct your psyche if you never speak. He became a cipher, and in that mystery, he found his freedom. We catch glimpses of him now, rare and fleeting, like sightings of a snow leopard. He is there at the state occasions, the funerals, and the coronations. At King Charles's coronation, while the cameras were obsessed with where Harry was sitting and what face he was making, Arthur was in the background, wearing his uniform, looking stoic, disciplined, and utterly unbothered. He is the living embodiment of the keep calm and carry on spirit that the country likes to believe it still possesses. But there is a darker, more complex texture to his silence. It is the silence of the Snowden legacy finally finding peace. For 3 generations, the Armstrong-Jones line has been screaming. Tony Snowden screamed through his art and his cruelty. Princess Margaret screamed through her behavior and her excesses. They were people who lived at high volume, desperate to be heard, desperate to be validated. They burned bright and they burned out, leaving a trail of wreckage behind them. In this reading of the family story, Arthur acts as a kind of firebreak, a point where the pattern of public drama and self-destruction appears to soften. He has seemingly reconciled the 2 warring halves of his DNA. He has the artistic sensitivity of his grandfather. He is still a student of art, a lover of nature, a young man who sees the world with a curator's eye. But he has encased that sensitivity in the Windsor discipline. He has built a container strong enough to hold the volatile liquid of his heritage. He is no longer the last Snowden prince who ran from his royal blood. He is the man who stopped running, turned around, and faced it. He realized that you cannot run from your blood, but you don't have to drown in it. You can filter it. Today, Arthur Chatto exists in a space that few royals ever reach. He is respected not for who he is, but for what he has done. When he walks into a room, he doesn't need to be announced. He carries the quiet authority of a man who has navigated the North Sea in a fiberglass shell, who has crawled through the mud of limestone, and who has looked his own physical frailty in the eye and didn't blink. He has achieved the holy grail of modern royalty: privacy. Today, by all available accounts, he lives a comparatively ordinary life, working outside the royal machine, spending time with friends, and keeping most of his private relationships out of the spotlight. But it is a hard-won normalcy. It is a normalcy forged in fire. As we look at the trajectory of his life, from the velvet page boy carrying the Queen's train, to the shirtless Instagram sensation, to the exhausted rower, to the broken recruit, to the silent officer, we see a story that is profoundly human. It is a story about the rejection of the easy path. The easy path for Arthur would have been to be a playboy, to drink the champagne, date the models, and drift into a comfortable, numb irrelevance. That is what was expected of a minor royal with a tragic grandmother. The script was written for him before he was born. Arthur Chatto took that script and threw it into the ocean. In many ways, his trajectory can be read as a mirror held up to the monarchy itself. As the institution struggles to define its purpose in the 21st century, Arthur offers a blueprint. It is not about celebrity. It is not about modernizing by becoming influencers. It is about service, endurance, and dignity. It is about doing the hard thing when nobody is watching. The Snowden demon has not been exorcised because you cannot exorcise a part of your soul, but it has been harnessed. The energy that once destroyed marriages and livers is now used to lead men, to climb mountains, to endure silence. Arthur Chatto is the proof that trauma does not have to be a destiny. You can inherit the wreckage of the past and build something seaworthy out of it. You can be the grandson of the tragedy and still write a happy ending. In the final analysis, Arthur Chatto teaches us that true nobility has nothing to do with lineage. It is the refusal to be defined by your scars. It is the courage to walk away from the applause and into the silence. He can be seen as a very different kind of spare, less a victim of circumstance than someone who volunteered for a harder, quieter path. He stripped away the titles, the expectations, and the golden handcuffs, and exposed himself to the raw elements of the world. The boy who ran from his royal blood didn't run away. He ran towards the man he was meant to be, and having found him, he has nothing left to say.